In his first inaugural address, President Ronald Reagan declared in the second paragraph, and let me remind you that the states formed the federal government and not the other way round. In Reagan's view, the federal government had become so heavy-handed, so commandeering, so authoritarian over the states that the American people needed a little history lesson and an indication of just where this then brand new president stood. Well, Reagan was right. The 13 colonies that fought the Revolution and won the Revolution and wrote the Constitution all preceded the federal government. They voluntarily associated with each other in order to form it. In one moment of victory from England, the colonies became states. The states were sovereign. They were nation states. They were as independent of each other as they were from England after the Revolution. They had their own governments, their own militias, their own courts, their own representatives to the other states. Fast forward to today. Our founding fathers are turning in their graves as to where America is, such a far cry from what they envisioned. So how can we bring it back? How can we bring America? How can we bring the federal government into the confines of the Constitution? Or as my next guest so eloquently states, it's time to part company. Here now is Walter Williams, professor of economics at George Mason University and a regular on Freedom Watch. So, Professor Williams, I'm going to use your phrase, I loved it, even though I didn't have any gray hair until I sat in the family court in New Jersey. Is it time for a divorce?
Well, maybe so. I think that our differences between various groups of Americans are becoming irreconcilable. That is, there's one group of Americans who wish to forcibly impose their vision on the rest of us, and there's another group of Americans who just want to be left alone. And so the question I asked in that particular column that you're referring to is that should we be forced to fight one another to get our way? That is, should liberty-oriented people be forced to fight with people who prefer tyranny? I say no. I think that we should part company. We should get a divorce, just like a married couple who aren't getting along. One person disobeys all the vows or just breaks all the vows. Well, should they stay together and fight, or should they become separated?
In a recent conversation on Freedom Watch, which we had with Professor Kirkpatrick Sale, with whose work I'm going to guess you are familiar. Yeah. He articulates that Vermont is a good place for this to start. It's a small, out-of-the-way state with a culture very different from Washington and from the lower 49. And if its legislature and at a referendum in an overwhelming number, the people voted to secede from the Union, it might actually get some sympathy from people throughout the rest of the country who agree with what you just said.
That is absolutely right. And matter of fact, there's a young group of people in the state of New Hampshire right next to Vermont. They call themselves freestateproject.org, and they're trying to get about 20,000 Americans to move to the state of New Hampshire,
right,
peaceably take over the political system, peaceably by voting, and then negotiate with Congress to obey the United States Constitution. And some of them, it's not official policy of freestateproject.org, but some of the members say if Congress does not obey the Constitution, will then issue a unilateral declaration of independence, just as our founders did in 1776.
I have to tell you that I was privileged to speak to the Free State Project in Nashua, New Hampshire, not too long ago, and I drove up from Boston. So I went from one of the most heavily regulated, micromanaged states in the world, the People's Republic of Massachusetts, to a place where freedom reigns in New Hampshire. I arrived at the hotel, and the first thing they said to me was, "Do you want to wear a gun?" I said, "What do you mean, do I want to wear a gun?" The guy said to me, "You're here. You're in the free state of New Hampshire. You can lawfully wear and carry a gun." I didn't want it. I didn't need it, but I was astounded, coming from New Jersey, where I live, from Boston, where I had just been, at the level of freedom that already exists in this state. Why do I tell you this story? I tell you this story because there are people and pockets of people in this country who agree with you. They're not in Washington, but they're all over the place outside of Washington.
And Judge, one of the rather remarkable things that you said, that you traveled from Massachusetts to New Hampshire, and you called the People's Republic of Massachusetts, but do you realize that Massachusetts, at the founding of our country, contained some of the most liberty-oriented men?
Yes. Yes, Sam Adams and his buddies would wish that their graves could be moved out of Massachusetts if they could have known what the government would be like today.
That is absolutely right, and a lot of people don't realize this whole issue about parting company or secession. That if in 1787, when they were debating the Constitution, if states did not believe that they could secede, the Constitution would have never been ratified.
Right.
That is, in the state of Virginia, in its constitutional meetings, as well as Rhode Island, and I believe New York as well, they explicitly say that if the federal government becomes abusive of the powers that we have delegated to them as principles, then we have the right to resume those problems.
You know, it's amazing that those resolutions were freely negotiated for contracts between the states joining the union and the federal government. Texas has negotiated at the time for the right to split into 5 states. Could you imagine 10 senators coming from Texas instead of 2? The folks that run the Congress would have a heart attack.
Right. And I think when you argue with people, people say, well, no states have a right to secede. Well, we have to recognize that, as you mentioned, that the end of the war between the states and Britain, there was a Treaty of Paris, and states became sovereign nations.
Right.
And so states came together in 1787 as principals, and they made the federal government their agent.
Correct.
And principals have the right to fire agents.
Absolutely. As well, Professor Williams, when the Supreme Court looked at the idea of secession after the Civil War, it said, in a case not involving secession, so the language is, as you know, what lawyers call dicta, sort of a statement the court made that wasn't directly germane to its finding. Nevertheless, it said, well, leaving the Union would be sort of like amending the Constitution. So certainly a state could leave if enough of the other states, probably 3/4, what it would take to amend the Constitution, agreed with it. So even after the Civil War, in the highest echelons of big government, in the progressive era, when the feds were beginning to control and regulate everything under the sun, the Supreme Court, in a majority opinion, recognized the power, ability, moral, and lawful authority of the states to secede from the Union.
Yeah. But, the bottom line, what I would like to see, and it looks like it's getting dimmer and dimmer, I would like to see the American people. I would like to see us to be able to convince most of the American people that Congress is behaving unconstitutionally and get the average American to love liberty and love our Constitution.
I think most people, when asked if they would prefer to have their lives micromanaged by the federal government or if they would prefer to be left alone, would clearly articulate, I'd rather be left alone.
That's right. Absolutely right.
Professor Williams, it's always a pleasure. Thanks for joining us on Freedom Watch.
Goodbye.
Thank you. You can catch today's show on foxnews.com/Freedom Watch and on Sirius 145 XM 168 or online at foxnewstalk.com at 6 p.m. Eastern on Saturdays. From New York, defending freedom. Until the next time, stay free, America.